Yeah, so my name's Matt. I run a podcast called Looking Sideways. And over the last, I guess, 3 or 4 years, I've been working with my friends at DB doing these things we've been calling creative exchanges, where we've been interviewing people with very successful creative careers. And, try to find out a bit more about how they got there, really. Like what the journey was for them, what the lessons they've learned, and what we as creative people can all learn from that experience. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're also going to talk a lot about Orlando's brilliant new film, Cycle of Love. And we're going to show a little clip, aren't we, in a minute? Yeah, so how you doing?
I'm good. I'm slightly nervous I'm going to get colds, but
it's a bold move.
Brave it out for
a bold move, I've got to say. I'm feeling undergunned up here, but you've gone for the old trouser suit. I like it. We're really old friends, and it was really nice last night, wasn't it? Because you had the nightmare journey, didn't you? You were like, what, trains, planes, automobiles. It was getting taxis. Like, yeah, I'll be there at 5, 6, 7, 8, and you got here about 9:30, didn't you? So we picked Orlando up from the station and went for a beer, and it was really nice, wasn't it? Because we were with another friend of ours, Tim Warwood, so we grew up in the snowboarding community, didn't we, in the UK? And yeah, it was good, wasn't it? We were a bit like, how the fuck are we still doing this all these years later? That community thing that we sort of came from. It's a nice little moment, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, I funnily enough, my entire filmmaking career began in snowboarding. And I suppose it's like a lot of action sports communities, or at least it was 20 years ago, that when you're sponsored, every time you're in a magazine or a video, you get a little bit of what used to be called photo incentive.
Yeah.
And it sort of creates this incentive for you and all your friends to learn how to film each other and take photographs. And I guess I kind of learned filmmaking doing that, filming my friends.
Yeah. Which we should get into, because I think that's one of the things, knowing where you started. It's so fascinating to see where you've ended up. But you've been on the road a lot, haven't you? Like last few weeks, because is this like officially like the promo trail for Cycle of Love?
So not quite. That'll probably start a little bit later. But we've just this new film. It's called The Cycle of Love. It's about a man who cycled from India to Sweden for love, and he did it 50 years ago. And I found the story incredibly inspiring, and we just launched it 2 months ago at the Telluride Film Festival, and it's just done a few festivals. So part of the way, for those who don't know, that you launch this, the film was independently funded, and what we do is we make the film using that money, and then we release it at the best festival that we can get into, and then you try and sell the film on the back of that. So we've just been doing that journey, and then it will launch in a way that everyone here could see it in sort of early next year.
So this is part of almost like the fundraising aspect.
The sales aspect.
You're on sales detail.
Yes.
Right. Okay. How do you find that?
It's tough. So anyone here that is in the documentary space, our industry has gone through a very rough period over the last couple of years, and whereas 5 or 6 years ago there were 20 different buyers of. Mostly what we make are feature documentaries, that's sort of 90-minute films that ideally they're sort of cinematic. They could play in the cinema if our cinemas existed in the way that they used to.
Yeah.
And that's gone from 20 buyers down to about 5 now. So it's
right.
And there's various reasons that we can talk about.
How quickly has that happened?
That's happened over the last 5 years.
Right. So it's shrunk that much.
Massive shrinkage. Yeah.
What do you put that down to then?
So there's multiple forces. There is the shift of advertising from TV channels to social media.
Yeah.
There is the growth of streamers, which has put pressure on other networks. There's also the shrinkage of people going to the cinema.
Yeah.
Because we can watch stuff at home really easily.
We can be doing that all day. Yeah.
So all of those forces have all kind of combined.
Yeah. Because one of the things I found really interesting, we're already going well off piste here, aren't we, from what we planned? But one of the things I found really interesting about that when we were talking about this last night in the bar was you were saying that it's kind of almost gone back to this patronage fundraising model, hasn't it? Because we were sort of making jokes about the Renaissance, where it's like rich people basically funding art, and you were saying, well, we're actually kind of that's where we're chasing finance from these days.
So there's a lot of truth in that, and I mean, America, it's been like that for a long time in funding documentaries. It's often been high net worth individuals who support, especially films that have social purpose. That the film is about an important social issue. Traditionally in Europe, we haven't had to do that because we've had public sector broadcasters with money, and they've supported the kind of films, at least that I make. But that money is drying up, and certainly in this country, more and more we rely on individuals who have money that believe in the issue of the film that we're making, and they support the film, and then we sell it afterwards to Netflix or Hulu or whoever else it might be. Yeah,
and those public broadcasters that you refer to obviously are like under attack like never before, really, from as we know. And that also has implications, I guess, for the type of stories that we might hear in the future, really, if it's very much at the whim of people with resources to make those decisions. But yeah, perhaps there's something we should come back to. So you're on the sales trail of the film. So one of the things I found really interesting about hearing how you came to make this film is the story that somebody gave you a book at an event. Because when I saw the film, which is absolutely brilliant, by the way, as you would expect, I was like, I kind of know this story. Like it occasionally does the cultural rounds, doesn't it? People, because PK, like, it is one of those striking stories, isn't it? As you say, like this guy decides to cycle across the world to find his lost love. And there is a book about it. So tell us about that. How did that come about? It's quite serendipitous, maybe.
So I was giving a talk in Sweden, and two young people approached me at the end of this talk, and they handed me a book and said, "This is the story of our it's our dad's story, and we'd like you to make a scripted film, not a documentary, a scripted film." And I immediately thought, I'm not known as a director who makes much scripted stuff, so I thought this must be a terrible story. They've come to me, that means Spielberg and everyone else has turned it down. And so I slightly ignored the book and I put it away, and I was very polite.
Because presumably that must happen a lot, like people coming up to you at things and saying, like, read, you get pitched essentially,
Yes, but it's normally a documentary story. Yeah. It's like something that's happening live.
Yeah.
And I put the book away and I went home, and a few months later I was going on holiday, and I saw the book and I thought, I'll have a read of this on the plane, and I started to read it. And I was like, oh my God, this story is phenomenal. I'm an idiot. What have I done?
Right.
And I got back in touch with them immediately and said, this is incredible. And they were like, well, Universal Pictures has been in touch.
Right.
Hollywood, Dev Patel's visited our parents. I was like, oh, okay, well, I've missed my opportunity.
Yeah.
But I stayed in touch with them. And 5 years later, I was talking to them. I said, I think you should do a documentary first, because PK, I'll tell you the story in a minute, is still alive. And we stayed in touch, and eventually we all collaborated on this film. And the story is it's about a man called PK who grew up in the east of India, and he was today he's a Dalit, but 50 years ago the word they used was untouchable. And when he was born, there was a prophecy that was made, and the prophecy, and a lot of families did astrological readings for their children when they were born, and the prophecy said, one day this boy will meet a woman from a faraway land. She'll be a Taurus, she'll be musical, and she'll own a jungle.
Yeah,
and
which is in the film is so brilliant, like the way it's conveyed. But there's that real magical realism quality to it, isn't there? Which presumably is something that really attracted you to the story, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
This it's full of sort of magic and myth. And anyway, PK, he had a very difficult upbringing, and he sort of ended up learning art as a way to escape the daily humiliations he went through as a Dalit. And he moved to Delhi when he was old enough to escape the caste system, and he became a street artist. And one day, this Swedish backpacker sits down in front of him, and he's drawing her, as he does every day, to lots of tourists, but he can feel a connection. And so just as she's about to leave, he says, can I ask you a question? She's like, sure. And he says, are you a Taurus? And she goes, yes, but how did you know? And then he goes, are you musical? And she goes, yes, I play the flute, the piano. And then he goes, and do you own a jungle? And she goes, no. And he goes, his heart sinks. But then she says, but my family own a forest. And he's like, oh my God, forest, jungle, it's the same thing. It's destiny. Anyway, they fall in love, and they have a few weeks together before she has to go back to Sweden. And they vow to be together again, and they exchange letters. But gradually her life starts to move on, and he realizes that if he doesn't do something radical, it's all over. And so one day he sells everything he owns, and he can't afford a plane ticket, but he can afford a bicycle. And he sets off. And the film is about the journey. So
it's like 50 years ago, right? Yeah. He's basically like a rally shopper, isn't he? Essentially. Yeah. So we're going to show a clip in a minute. And we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of almost like the technical challenges that this project posed for you. Because it wasn't filmed, was it, that journey? He didn't have a phone. No.
Unfortunately, this is the tricky thing. He didn't have a documentary crew following him.
That's the thing that really struck me about watching it, the way that how imaginatively that's been brought to life, that journey. And that's obviously something that comes up a lot in the reviews and the early notices. But before we get to that, and we will show about a 5-minute clip we're going to show, when you're looking at these stories, like what was it about that story that, because it sounds like it was immediate. It sounds like you read that book and you were like, okay, I'm in, So what, is that common when you're developing projects, because obviously, Virunga, the White Helmets, Evelyn, very personal film of yours, like your whole filmography, like is that a common thing that you just sort of know what the right idea is to make your next project?
I think there's when I hit it, there's a few different elements that I think I look for. I mean, the first is ultimately, when it's about an individual or a group of individuals, it's really, am I inspired by them and what they do? And, because for these films take years to make, and you're going to spend a lot of time with these people, and you want to really believe in them. And the best, when I find the stories that I'm most passionate about, it's those people make me want to be a better human in my own life. And in this particular case, there's a part of this story, PK, he suffered from a sort of a lack of self-belief because of the experiences he had growing up. But along the journey, he met lots and lots of people who were very kind to him, who helped him sort of find belief in himself. And I have to say that's one of the things that I most wanted to focus on. A story about, we're just bombarded every day about how awful people around the world are, how there's no hope for humanity.
Yeah. And
this is a story ultimately about the goodness in people. And I found that really...
It's very romantic. I know that sounds like almost a stupid word to use, but in a sort of classical sense. And the way that the title, and the way that you... Like, it is a unapologetically hopeful film, isn't it? Where you're... And it struck me again, looking at some of your previous work. Like, often you're dealing with, like, pretty gritty themes. You're dealing with, like, almost like the worst side of humanity. Was that another reason why this was, at this point in your career, was a story that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, and in short, Matt, yes, I have made a lot of films that are about very, very difficult issues. I mean, I think they're also about the best of people.
Yeah.
But this one felt it was mostly about the good in people, and is very hopeful. And
so it's like you're like glorying in it though as a director in this film. Do you know what I mean? Like you're really having fun as a storyteller, like leaning into that to the degree that you do. So is that? Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting to was it like tonally, was it an important shift for you to sort of take on? I have to say, I now only want to do films like this. Yeah.
But I mean, it doesn't work like that, because especially as a documentarian, the stories you follow, they change as you're making the film.
Yeah.
And you're at service of whatever direction that story takes you in.
Yeah. Well, should we show this clip, and do you want to set it up maybe?
Yeah. So as Matt was alluding to, that PK sadly didn't film his journey when he did it 50 years ago. And so that
he went on YouTube, was he?
wasn't on YouTube. So that presented a real problem in how to actually make this film. How do you visualize it? How does the audience understand what happened? And part of that is I made a film 8 years ago about my family. I had a brother, which maybe we'll talk about.
I'd love to talk about that.
Who took his own life, and we made a film about, like, basically after that happened, my family, no one spoke about my brother for about 13 years, and one day it just felt we needed to start this conversation. And I thought, as a filmmaker, well, maybe we can talk about this as we make a film about why we haven't spoken about my brother. And the idea was we walked from Scotland, where my brother's grave is, back down to London, going to places where we'd all spent time together as a family. One of them was here in the Lake District. But the thing about the film is, a lot of the film is about meeting people along the way and having these extraordinary conversations with complete strangers. And I wondered, from that experience, I wondered if that was a way to tell PK's story. And so what we did is I found a very, very talented actor, young actor from India, and we recreated parts of PK's journey. And along the way, we met real people, and this actor, his name's Chirag Lobo, had these unbelievable conversations. So apart from him and another actor who plays Lotta, who's the love interest, I suppose, everybody else in the film is a real person, and all the conversations are real. And I tell you that because the clip you're going to see is one of those conversations.
Brilliant. Should we play it? So that scene when I watched the film really struck me because, I mean, there's so many layers to the way you've had to piece the story together, right? Obviously, you've got the to-camera interviews, which are brilliant. You've got the acted segments with the two actors that you described where, they're, scripted, I assume.
There's no script.
At all.
Everything was improvised.
Everything was improvised. So those exchanges with Lotta and PK, as depicted, were improvised. That was all improvised. I mean, it's so fascinating. So, like, how much directing were you doing there then?
None. I mean, very, very little actually. All we'd really do is when we sort of street cast this film for scenes like that. We'd meet people and we'd find a little bit about their personal story. I'd brief Chirag, the actor, to possibly ask certain questions. But then other than that, we just film it. So what you actually see in the film is you see conversations like that with people from Afghanistan, from Iran, with backpackers that we met in a youth hostel, and they just talk about like that, hopes and dreams and love and things like that. The film's really it tells an old story, but it also says something which I hope is a universal story about humanity.
What was behind that creative decision? Because you could have scripted it, right?
We could have scripted it. I think if we'd have scripted it, then I don't know if it would have really been a documentary anymore.
Yeah.
And I think what we've tried to do, we've tried to be really experimental, and obviously that's not a traditional documentary scene.
This is why it's so interesting, though, isn't it? Because it's blurring the boundaries of like what you would consider to be a normal documentary. Because, like you say, it's improvisatory as well. Like, what I'm getting at. Like the intention of that for you as an artist was presumably part of the appeal of the approach, right?
Yes, and I think there's probably some of you have seen Nomadland, which was a brilliant film, and there's definitely a blurring from the scripted side into the documentary space, and likewise from the documentary space into the scripted side. I find that fascinating.
Yeah.
But for me, that scene is the actor plays the role normally that I would play as a director filming a purely documentary scene. In that you do, if a conversation plays out, sometimes you do steer it because obviously things have to be real, but sometimes you might ask someone a question to steer that conversation. So for me, those scenes are really documentary scenes, but with there's an actor in the mix.
Who's also got a huge amount of responsibility, really, there to carry that, right? You just said he's almost doing what I might do sometimes, directing it. So, like, tell me about the relationship, because you said he's a young actor, right? You said
he's a theatre actor.
What's his name?
His name's Chirag Lobo.
Okay.
He's fantastic. He's a theatre actor, but what he's brilliant at is improvising.
Yeah.
And actually, to prepare for the film, we went in. I live in South London, and we went and did a lot of that sort of stuff just with random people on the streets, where he'd set up a sort of a sketch stall, and he'd draw people, and he'd have these conversations.
Yeah.
And we did a lot of that to practice, and then we went to India and started traveling, and it worked out quite well.
Was that? I mean, yeah. I mean, it works brilliantly, which is what one of the reasons that the film's so powerful, isn't it? But was that something that because you said that it was informed by your experiences of making Evelyn, which is really interesting for me to connect those dots. I haven't seen that film as well. Did you have that idea at the time of making Evelyn? Was that something that you almost stored, like that you could do, or was it when this project came up you thought actually maybe that's the way in? Because I think what really got me about this film is like the scale of trying to recreate that in a sensitive and believable way. Like, because like, I was like, we could have scripted it, but like that'd be a very standard way of doing it, wouldn't it? To cast people and to try and do it in that sort of traditional documentary way, or like make it a scripted film or whatever, which I imagine is the way that people have approached this story before. But was it when you started to think about creatively, like how you could do it in a unique way that sort of approach came to mind?
I think I actually thought originally you couldn't do this as a documentary purely because there was no footage. So
yeah.
I didn't, and then I started. The more I thought about it, had that idea and thought actually maybe this is possible. But I obviously when you go and raise money, you have to be 100% confident that your creative idea is going to work.
Yeah.
The truth is, I was terrified and I had no idea if this would work until we really got back into the edit.
Right.
And we started to put it together, and we were like, oh, okay, I think it does work.
So it was full flying blind.
I mean, it always is.
Yeah, but that's kind of next level. That's next level, though, isn't it? Really, in terms of like how. And I was going to ask you about the fundraising part of that, because you've obviously been quite clear that the way that you've done this is to make it and then sell it. So because presumably that would be quite a tough pitch if you were out there trying to raise money. Does that give you the creative freedom to do it the way that you've done it, like to make it on your own terms and then have a sort of finished piece, if you like?
It does. I mean, yes, the one advantage of doing the independent funding model is exactly that, Matt.
Yeah.
You can kind of make the film that you want to make, that you really believe in. I mean, obviously, you have to convince everybody to fund it, and it's very difficult because instead of dealing with one funder, you're dealing with 20. But you do ultimately get to make the film that you really believe in.
Yeah. So how are you feeling about it then, having put it out in the market a little bit, and given that you've just described to us how difficult this market is right now, like, are you feeling good about it? Do you think there's going to be an audience for it? Do you think the industry will help you take it forward?
I'm feeling really good. So this film's only done 3 film festivals, and the first was this film festival called the Telluride Film Festival in America, and I've never experienced sort of audience reactions like it, and people sort of coming out whooping at the end of the film.
Yeah.
So I do believe there's an audience for it,
That's
and
a good sign, isn't it?
Can't wait for people to see it.
It is very, very powerful and very beautiful. Yeah. So, yeah, it'd be great to see where it leads. Because the other thing about your projects, which you must have experienced quite a few times now, is like presumably they've taken you to some pretty amazing places, right? Something like the White Helmets. You won an Oscar. They do seem to take on a life of their own, your films, once they get out into the world, right? So it'd be interesting to see where this one leads. But I did want to go back to the beginning, yeah, because like we said, we go back a long way, and I met you. I guess you were really young, like I was probably 20, you were probably like 18 or something, like, and it was skateboarding and snowboarding, right, that sparked your interest in this. So tell me, is it the classic story of like of our generation, which I'm sure a lot of people in this room would recognise, as a kid, you get inspired by these cultures. The films, the music, the creativity is such a huge part of it. And so many people that come from our world began by thinking, well, like, the DIY thing, we've talked about this on my podcast before. Was that something is that where it began?
That's absolutely where it all began. I think, you like I said, I sort of learned the craft filming Friends, but the amazing thing about in this case the snowboard community, but I would say this is the same for any action sports, is you have this small sort of microcosm of the bigger world where you can, in the creative space, you can test something to a much smaller audience, and in some ways there is already an audience that exists, and it's much more gentle. Whereas if I wasn't part of the snowboard scene and I just made a film and you're just putting it out into the world, I think that would be much harder, and it allowed me to have the opportunity to make these little films.
Yeah,
a bit of money from a brand.
They're ambitious from the start, though. I think, weren't they? Your films, like even back then, you were trying to reach a bit high. You did some like pretty crazy trips early on. But then the first thing that really got you any attention was Skaterstan, right? Which we were. I mean, I was like, oh, it was about 10 years ago, and you're like, no, actually, it was like 2009, was it? And I think that film looks even more ahead of its time now, the more time goes on, because there are, those stories around the power of these activities to change lives in less fortunate and privileged corners of the world are. That I think we're all probably quite familiar with those stories now, but at the time that was quite a new thing, wasn't it? Like to sort of look at this culture from that perspective. So where did you first hear about that, and was it? I imagine at the time you were like, "That's just a really good story that I'm gonna, this is a natural evolution for me from making this sort of classic, like go where your mates, do the films." There's a lot of that going on this weekend, right? But that was the first time, was it, that you were like, "Okay, there's a bit more depth here."
So I sort of finished. I'd made a number of snowboard films. I thought I knew how to make a documentary, and I started to make journalistic investigations, often about something really, really bad happening in the world, and we go and investigate it. I mean, this might be about conflict in Ivory Coast or pollution in Ethiopia or whatever. And it was while making those films, and they were very difficult films to make, I kept coming across really positive stories. And I remember thinking, I want to make the film about the really positive story, but I didn't really see any way to get that commissioned by a news network, who were the kind of organisations I was working for at the time. And then one day I read about this skateboard school in Kabul. And it was this school that pulled in street children. The skateboarding pulled them in. They got a meal, and then really it was about giving them an education. They got to learn maths, and mix different ethnic groups in Afghanistan together. And I thought, this story's amazing. It brings all my love of action sport,
all of your interests,
all of my interests. Plus, it's in the kind of location that I was making a lot of films, and there was an advert by the clothing company Diesel for a few £1,000s for films about youth culture, and I applied with this idea, and they said, yeah, sure, go and do it. And so I went out with a cinematographer for a few weeks, and we made a short 9-minute film about this school. And there was no distribution plan. We just put it on Vimeo, but it went totally viral. And for me, it sort of blew my mind that actually there really was an audience for more kind of hopeful stories, and in some ways that actually shaped then the next sort of several films that I made. That was the lens I was interpreting them all through. Because
you, okay, this is the perfect sort of intersection of my interest, but also people are interested, and there is an appetite for this type of story that looks at these things. Because it's been super influential. I mean, there's a charity called Skaterstan now, isn't there? Which your film had a lot to do with, obviously. Yeah. So I guess the next, we'll talk about your brother and Evelyn towards the end, if that's all right. But then, I think that Virunga was probably the next project was that immediately after Skaterstan?
That came a few years later, but very much. So Virunga was I was making a film in Sierra Leone, and I picked up a newspaper, and there was a story about this place called the Virunga National Park, which I'd never heard of, and it had mountain gorillas and a permanent lava lake, and it basically looked like Jurassic Park. But the story was about this group of rangers rebuilding this park after 20 years of war, and I thought that's a really positive story about rebirth.
Well, and I mean, I watched it again recently, and I think we talked a bit about this earlier, and I think one of the things that really stood out to me is it turned into a slightly different story, right? Like as you went to investigate that story, it became. How is that for you as a filmmaker? That experience, like because a lot of what you've done up until this point has been planned, right? You know, you've got a story, there's a very strong journalistic element to what you do, obviously. But by and large, you know what story you're walking into. You know what you're going to try and get out of it. But that was quite different, right, in that case?
Very different and terrifying, frankly.
Yeah, which really comes across as well.
So eventually, one of the key things in documentary is what we call access, which is ultimately convincing if you think you found a story, it's convincing the people that the story's about to let you make a film with them. And it often involves a phone call or an email. And I'd emailed the Virunga National Park many times, and they'd ignored everything. And eventually somebody responded and said, "Fine, you're persistent, come out." So I went out and I sort of said, "This is the film that I think's really great and I want to make." And they listened, and we spent a week together. And towards the end of the week, where I guess they decided I wasn't a total idiot, they said, "Your film, the film you want to make, Orlando, that's very good, well done. But really, there's a bigger story here about an oil company from your country, and that's the story that you should really look at." And this oil company was illegally exploring for oil in the park. And so I guess my experience of doing journalistic investigations kind of kicked in, and the film took this massive U-turn, and it was completely terrifying because it suddenly was a very, very different story. It wasn't the story that I thought I was making, but I'd like to think the core element, kind of core essence of a film about the rebuilding of this park and Congolese heroes is still the central idea in the film itself.
When you say terrifying, literally as well, but as in creatively as well, as in because it was so unknown.
Yeah, exactly. Terrifying on multiple levels.
Yeah.
Yes.
And did you surprise yourself the way you handled it?
I for a lot of that film, I didn't really know what I was doing. I'll be honest. I ended up living there in a tent in the park for a year, spread out over 2 years, and I think the only way to make that film was to really sort of be there and experience everything that this park goes through. You have to see the film to see what happens, but a conflict starts while I was making the film. So it was a very difficult film to make.
Yeah, and you've talked about style quite a lot today. You know, you've talked about, and we were on this discussion last night. How would you describe the way that you approach these? Because we were making the comparison between, I was mentioning like quite a well-known sort of documentary, big budget, glitzy, and you were more like, for you, it's really important actually to have that agility, to have that boots on the ground approach, to make sure that your access is such a key part of it, as you said. Is that, presumably this is being informed all the time by these different experiences, including with Virunga, and then as we get onto the White Helmets as well, which is, the film that really sort of catapulted you to a global prominence. And again, is taking, presumably, the lessons that you learned from Virunga around these themes into another level, really. Did that you gaining that experience and presumably confidence as well, because it's such a huge part of it, is to think, okay, I'm actually ready to tell this story. Did that help almost prepare you for an experience like making the White Helmets?
I think the one, if I was to sort of beyond actually the sort of style on screen, I'd say the key thing to the films that myself and my team make, it's really about partnership with the people that the film is about.
Yeah.
And film is inherently an extractive, like the filmmaking process is extractive. You're ultimately asking people to share very difficult things about their lives to make ultimately a product that's then sold and other people, enjoy. And so we work very hard to try and make that process as unextractive as possible. And that's there's lots of different ways that we do that, but ultimately it starts at the relationship with the people that the film is about. Sometimes that's it's working hand in hand with them as co-producers. Sometimes it's working with them very carefully on an impact campaign that the film has. It's also it's a lot about listening. You go in. I used, once upon a time, I'd go in at the beginning thinking I knew exactly what the film was about and just go and make that film. And actually, now it's much more. I have an idea. You start to make the film, and you do a lot of listening from when you go on location to try and understand. Because actually, you're generally wrong, because you've been doing a lot of research online. But when you're there, the reality is very different, and I think you need to be flexible to that. And there's multiple other things I could talk a long time about how to make filmmaking less extractive, but these are just some of the things.
Yeah, and I guess there's a voyeurism trap as well, right, for the viewer, if it's not handled really carefully, because especially for like privileged Western audiences to sort of look at some of these stories. But I think you can really see that development in this film, because obviously what you've talked about there is the cycle of love. I mean, because obviously what you've talked about there is and that's kind of why I used the word confidence quite mindfully earlier. Letting the story dictate to you where it should go. I mean, with the cycle of love, obviously you've done that to a very, very high degree, really. Actually stepping right back and saying, I'm going to almost give up control. You can prepare, can't you? You can do the things that you described. You can do these. You talked about being in South London, doing those things, but to actually then go and make that film is pretty different, right, from making Skatistan, where you've gone there with an idea. I think that's one of the things is somebody who's followed your career and seen you develop as a filmmaker that I really enjoyed about the cycle of love, seeing that. Yeah, I mean, it's bold, isn't it? You must have felt that when you were doing it. Did it feel like a risky way of making that film, or was it just the film you sort of I think I know the answer, but you needed to make it that way?
I think as I've got more, I mean, like I said before, I think every film feels like a risk, and you never quite know how it's going to turn out. But I guess as I've got older and I definitely trust the process a lot more. And I think if you put in place the right foundations, the right team around you, be that on screen or behind the camera, I definitely have more confidence in just letting things play out. And a bit of gentle steering around the edges, and in the cycle of love, for instance, I would occasionally whisper in Chirag's ear, why don't you ask something like this, or why don't you do something like this, and let's see what happens.
So we've got 15. I think we should talk a little bit about your film, Evelyn. And then I wonder if you're taking a few questions, maybe?
Of course, yeah.
Do five,
anyone can ask anything.
5 minutes of questions, I think, would be nice. So I wouldn't want to be as presumptuous as to say, it's your most personal film, but obviously it is about suicide. It is about your brother. Your family's in it. You're in it. There's a level of vulnerability in that film which is very, very stark, let's say. And it is quite different from your other projects, notably how much you're in it, as a main character, which is different, right? Tell me about those creative choices when it came to that. Because you said earlier that part of the genesis of that film was that your family, and the film obviously goes into this really clearly, and if you haven't seen this film, it's so powerful and such a brilliant exploration of these issues. But you mentioned that the family haven't talked about it for 13 years, and I think you said, I thought, almost we need to have this out in a way, so you chose this forum by which to do that. So were those creative decisions that I just quickly outlined, did you feel like this is how it needs to be done?
So this film really began, we just released our film, The White Helmets, which was about rescue workers in Syria. And my producer on that film, her name is Joanna Natsagara, we were talking about what we were going to do next. And I was pitching her very similar sort of ideas to The White Helmets and Virunga. And she, just out of the blue, said, why don't you make a film about your brother? And I was totally shocked about this, because I'd never said anything to her about my brother. I just didn't speak about this because it was too painful. And I got really angry with her. And I was like, how dare you even ask that? This isn't something I want.
She sounds good, though.
She's very good. She's a very good filmmaker. And then afterwards, I was like, why have I got so angry? That's not healthy. And suddenly I thought, that's something I should then explore. Why is this such a something I can't even talk about? And I remember I emailed my family and said, would you ever consider making if I made a film about Evelyn, would you consider being in it? And all of them immediately just said yes, because I think we'd all been waiting for an opportunity to do it.
Or maybe
talk about him.
Permission.
I think that's exactly it, Matt.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to give more credit to Joanna and the team. My idea was that I was going to sort of film it, and really it was going to be about my family, and I'd be behind camera. And the team, it was the same team I'd made Virunga the White Helmets with. There was a lot of trust, and they're like, "Don't be an idiot. You've got to be in this."
Yeah.
And I found that so difficult. I found making this film a complete nightmare. Very, very. Obviously, it was very painful, but I also found it excruciating being on camera. But I mean, the film in the end, really, if I just look at it in structural terms, it's really about me.
Yeah, and that's why it's so powerful, though, because that does come across in that film.
It wasn't meant to be.
But like yeah, I used the word vulnerability earlier, I think, and it's an incredibly vulnerable piece of work by everybody involved, like your whole family. Like, it's not pretty, some of it, is it? It's essentially that film's about generational trauma, isn't it? Which I think you get to a certain age, you're like, oh, that's the thing, So you know what I mean, though, like that's obviously what was unfolding on screen, and there's quite a bravery to that, right? So your producer sounds, yeah. She had your number.
She did.
Yeah,
she really did.
Definitely. Okay, I got one more question, just to shift gears a little bit. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's also very successful today, and he said he was talking about luck. He was saying that he basically said, "Well, I've been really lucky," and I've heard that from a few, because I think I assume if there's people in the room who are creative people who might have. Perhaps things haven't turned out. Like, you make projects that don't go the way you want them to, or blah, blah, blah. And I often do, we got into it quite a bit, like the role of luck in creative careers, and like how it is actually probably quite an unspoken thing. Yeah. I wonder what your views are on that, really. Because you've had some breaks over the years, like it's been, I just wonder what your view is on it, because it is a bit of an unspoken in the creative world, isn't it? Do you consider that's had any role in the way that your career's gone?
I mean, massively. I consider myself incredibly lucky in all, not just in terms of the way the breaks that we've had making films, but for my entire life. I mean, definitely it'd be crazy for me to not say I was very, very fortunate and lucky.
Yeah.
In multiple layers.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you've made your own luck as we've heard today, in such a large degree by the risks you've taken and the projects you've taken on. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. So does anyone want to ask a question? It's what we normally do in these things. Who's out of the back? I'll go here and I'll come to you. I'm going to get up. Can I take this over there? Is that all right? John Moy in the house.
Thanks, buddy. Orlando, it's really interesting to hear you talking about your films, and you work in these subjects that could easily be told as very negative stories, particularly like working through something like your own grief and trauma with your family. I'm just curious, like, what your opinion is on the value of a creative process in dealing with grief, as somebody who's gone through that yourself, but then also maybe shooting stories with people that are going through that themselves, and how you make that a positive thing for them, and that it's not extractive on their own suffering.
That's
a good one.
It's a very good question. So I'll separate. Just on a personal level, for me, making that film was completely transformative. And yes, it was very tough, but it entirely transformed my own relationship with my brother, my relationship with grief, and understanding how grief works. It was, on that level, it was incredibly powerful, and not just this. It's not hyperbole. It changed my life, and I used to see being vulnerable and emotional as a weakness, and I see that the opposite. I see that as a strength and a power. So on a personal level, massive. For other people, this is something that's developed over the 20 years of making films. It's about doing it very, very, very carefully and slowly, and making sure that people are comfortable and feel safe the entire way you do it. You can I mean, you know, without getting too deep into re-traumatizing people, it's very easy to totally stuff that up if there's no sort of trust and relationship built, and you just start asking people the most difficult questions about the most difficult moment of their life, which is often what films are about. They are about people's most challenging moments. You have to do that. You have a real responsibility as a filmmaker to do that stuff carefully and appropriately. And I've learned that. I didn't go to film school. Snowboarding was my film school, so I didn't know this stuff, and I definitely got it wrong at the beginning, but I've learned that through trial and error, and I take it very, very seriously in how we make our films and make people feel safe and you know, so that they can be vulnerable.
Thanks, John. Who's at the back? There's somebody at the back. All right, I'm going to pass this to Lindsay. There you go.
Thanks so much for that. I would love to know how often you choose to self-shoot, and when you choose to work with a camera operator, and when you're working with a camera operator, how do you direct them? Do you do storyboards? Are you over their shoulder? Yeah, but I'm excited to see your new film. It sounds great.
Thank you. Okay, so I began shooting almost everything myself, and I shot Virunga, a lot of it myself, but I then met a cinematographer called Kendal, who, when I met him, I realised how much better he was at filming than I was, and then almost since then, I've done very, very little shooting, just because he's so much better at it than me. I'm shooting something myself at the moment purely from a financial reason, because it's cheaper. And I've fallen in love again with filming myself, and there's a beautiful intimacy to doing that with the people that you're making a film about. But seeing as I don't do that mostly, I mostly work with Frank. I think we talk a lot about how we approach scenes, and then mostly he shoots it, and occasionally I might whisper something in his ear, but ultimately you just let the scene play out. So it's light touch when we're actually recording, but there's a lot of talk and prep beforehand.
Anyone else? Hello. Easy walk.
So I'm not familiar with the story, but I've got to know, because I can't wait till April, that there was a happy ending.
That would be a massive spoiler.
Yeah, that is the big spoiler. Well, I was sworn to secrecy. Anyone else? Yeah. There you go.
Thanks very much. Hey, so I know that you won an Academy Award for Best Director some years back. And I wonder if you could impart any advice or insights, as we're a team on our first Oscars campaign at the moment. And we're noticing that creative merit is a part of it, certainly, but there's also other components, finance, network, how much energy you put into it. I wonder if you have any advice on your experiences.
So you're doing an Oscars campaign.
You didn't plug your film.
Yeah, go on. What's your film?
It's called Alice. It's screening at 4:15 today in the Brewery Arts Studio.
I mean, that would be a start. Brilliant. And it's been nominated for an Oscar?
We are currently under consideration.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
Okay, so brilliant. So I mean, you know, this probably will come as no surprise to everybody that any form of campaign is ultimately it's political. And doing an Oscars campaign, you're right. Yes, of course, creative merit is important, but it's also there is a small pool of, BAFTA or the Oscars. There's a small pool of voters, and you have to get them to watch your film and like your film, and probably also like you as a filmmaking team. There's a lot of that, and money comes into it, because if they're going to watch your film, they probably need to have heard about it. I'm assuming your film's a documentary. I think this year there's 250 films that have been submitted for the Oscars for the documentary category. So there's a lot for people to watch. So you need to make sure that people see it. And then obviously it being in the press helps. I mean, this is a longer conversation, but it is a full-time job. It can be a full-time job, and which is very difficult. I think when I've done this process a number of times. We've had a lot of the films we make. There's also a social impact campaign tied to the film. We try to make the film do something positive in the world. So in some ways that helps justify spending a kind of a full-time job working with the film. And yes, that dovetailed very nicely with an academy campaign as well. But that's often how we did it in the past.
You guys should talk afterwards. I've got time for one more. Anyone? Come on. There we go.
Hi, Orlando.
Hello.
I was just curious about a dangerous situation, or one of the most dangerous situations you've been filming in this area, and whether they made it on the screen or not. Thank you.
So I'm a coward, just to be clear, and I've definitely made a number of films in very difficult places, but I don't consider myself brave in any way, and I definitely run from danger. When we made Virunga, there was this war started. It had been a war that had been simmering for a long time, but it picked up again, and the front line shifted several times over the national park where I was staying. That was definitely the most dangerous situation I've ever been in. But I at the same time, you always check your privilege. Really, as a journalist filmmaker, I could always leave, and the people there couldn't. And so when I get terrified, I'd always think about that. And I remember the park rangers would always say, "Come on, Orlando, pick yourself up."
Yeah. That was brilliant, mate. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.